Originally, my supervisor, Sammy Pretzel, was going to present on our banning treatment plant over on the Youghiogheny River that utilizes mine pools for various reasons. And she got pulled down to Texas for work. And I had only just a minor involvement in banning. It's essentially the polishing wetland. I could have probably bullshitted my way through it, but I told her, I was like, you know, we're kind of like near Shamokin and Mahanoid, and seeing what Dan and the Upcammer boys presented, I was like, well, why don't we just talk about Shamokin and, you know, some of the things that, you know, it's one of those watersheds where I think we know what needs to occur, but the how and where we still aren't sure about yet, and there's questions within that how and where that need to be answered to get to that point where we start designing and constructing. So I know the Upcammer maps are just tremendous, you know, in what they've done there and what they presented here. This is going to be a 10,000 foot level here, so I love this map here. This is from the Scarlett report back in the 70s, and it kind of has that pool and multicolory unit feel to it, and so you can get a sense of where these discharges and where these mine pools are on Shamokin Creek. And you're gonna see this map a lot because I love maps and I love laser pointers and all that stuff. So you're gonna see it often. So once again, my name's Tom Clark from Kleinfelder. Kind of just a background on Shamokin Creek. Shamokin Creek's right across the river from us here, essentially. Drains 137 square miles, mainly in Northumberland, a little bit in Columbia and Montour. Like I said, it enters on the other side of the river near Sunbury. It's a great, like when you see it on a map, and I have it here on a different map, 1/3 of it, the headwaters 1/3, drains a large portion of the western middle field, and then it kind of cuts through. I think that's is it called Big and Little Mountain there, right by Shamokin? Is that what those mountains are called? Big and Little, right? Big Mountain. It kind of cuts through, and then you're outside of the geology, and it becomes more of like an agricultural valley stream, and it's you could see it, and I love looking at it. It's just one of those things, and but consequently, it's a watershed that suffers the consequences of that western middle mining. Pretty much every headwater tributary is listed impaired. A lot of them are lost streams. The entire 32.5 miles of the main stem is listed as impaired. In my opinion, we're doing some work on Moshannon Creek. Moshannon Creek was always in my mind as the worst impaired tributary out in the bituminous area. And I always felt like Shamokin and Mahanoy was kind of like its comparison out here in the anthracite. But that doesn't mean the issues are not solvable. We're currently solving them in Moshannon Creek, and I think they could be done here in Shamokin as well. So I'm going to jump out here. I have a big voice, so I don't think it's going to be a problem. We're kind of sitting in over here somewhere. I have bad eyesight. Shamokin Creek there, Mahanoy Creek underneath it there. We're on the other side of the river. And that's that map I'm talking about right there. You can see the upper third of it. It's just, and what I have turned on there is the problem areas and the AML features, the AML points. I have the discharge points that have been sampled. And you can see how it's that upper third. It's just littered, and then it breaks through Big Mountain there, and then it becomes, kind of comes into this agricultural valley stream, but it suffers the consequences of the upper third. Pictures down below, that's Shamokin Creek rolling through Shamokin City there. I do believe that's where Maysville borehole comes in on the right, but it looks like that the whole way. The major pollutant there is absolutely iron. Secondarily, it's acidity. Aluminum, in my mind, and you'll see it from the data, is inconsequential. If you're going to treat the iron, the aluminum's going to fall out earlier, and there's not as much of it as there is iron. So it's really just iron, acidity, and not much else. Probably third is more sewage, probably, in that stream in terms of impact. So back to this map. It has these, what Mike called these multicolory units. And I kind of put a definition later here on what I kind of always thought multicolory units are, but like The dotted lines there are showing essentially the collieries, and those were the boundaries of mining companies. But a lot of times there's been communication then between those barrier pillars to where these collieries have become multi-colliery, and they're essentially drained then by like one or several outfalls. So in this area here, you tend to have, there's 4 big ones. You got Scott right there in the pink, Excelsior in the yellow, Henry Clay Sterling in the green, and then Cameron over there in the blue, and then you have a smattering of smaller ones. And you'll see, just because they're the largest multi-colliery units, they're also the largest flows, and those are the ones that you have to figure out how to treat if you ever want to get Shamokin back. The water quality of these discharges is not intense. They're not water qualities I think would scare any of us in the audience that do this type of work. What scares you is the high flows that can happen after precipitation events from those outfalls. That's the main problem that has to be resolved to be able to put these discharges into plants to treat. So that's kind of like the definition, and I don't know if I stole this, or I don't know, it's just like that's kind of always been the way I've kind of thought of those units. Once segregated coal company deep mines that have now become connected via various means and drained by the same outfall or outfalls. It's kind of the way I've always thought about those. So Shamokin kind of has 8 of these, MCU outfalls, if you want to talk it like that. So from upstream and downstream, Richards, the reason I have a question mark on it is it's because it's up in here. That's Richards, kind of like right in there. It should be in the Scott MCU, and it wasn't always a discharge. Anecdotally, I've heard this from people, and it occurred at some time in the past. It should be in Scott, so it's almost like its own project. Like the question up at Richards is, can you get it back down to where it should be in the Scott? And then the whole thing here is about trying to lessen waters and trying to build 2 or 3 plants instead of 7 or 8, right? So you got the pink Scott there, which is the largest iron loading impact to Shamokin. Excelsior is kind of like right behind it. And then you got a smattering of small ones in here, smaller, but they still have meaningful flows and iron loading. So Corbin, Maysville, Big Mountain is this kind of like purple one, and you got Sterling and Cameron here, which is kind of like one of the big 4, and then Cameron up here in the blue, which is and this is where it kind of breaks through Big Mountain there, and you're outside of mining geology. Lots of numbers here. So what this is, these are those, let's call them the 8 primary MCU outfalls. This is a kind of a conglomeration of data. Camera took a lot in 23 and 24, I think was that year. There was some stuff I had from like 20 to 24. So that's kind of like your pH, your hot acidity, iron, and aluminum. It's kind of like various agency data all kind of brought into one. On the left is kind of a more historical, from the time we had good flows on these streams up until now, giving you the min, the median, and the max. So as you can see, the first thing on just like the quality, particularly on like the big 4, Scott, Excelsior, they pop around 6, maybe slightly greater than 6. They're just slightly net acidic in terms of hot acidity. And you can see the iron is, it's elevated, but it isn't like intense. We're treating things that are worse than that. Aluminum is really inconsequential. And a lot of these things are popping out. They're full of carbon. These are pools that are, oftentimes they're flooded. There's no DO in them. So, and we can use that carbon to, lessen maybe the lime usage, through decarbonization for these plants that have always been speculated. But the big problem here, and that's what I have in the red, are particularly the flows of the big 4. The medians don't really scare me, even though they're pretty high. That's 1 million gallons per day, by the way. I'll show some gallons per minute later. But the maximum MGD is what scares you. Just not sure. That would be a massive active treatment plant to accommodate that flow. So when you see those flows, you start thinking about, well, what's the 95% confidence interval flow? And do I have to have a bypass? Or like, what I'm gonna suggest here is, can we use the mine pool to kind of control the amount of water that we're giving a plant? Can we drop a mine pool during a dry, during a period before precipitation event comes in, and it kind of, and so instead of your flows going like this, it's more like a sine curve, and you can kind of control them. And to me, you solve that in Shamokin Creek, everything else kind of falls quickly behind. Same type of thing here, just looking at loading. So I have iron loading and acidity loading, and sulfate loading kind of follow the sulfate. I always try to when I'm in, talking, like my kids are geologists and stuff, and I was telling them this not too long ago. I was like, that sulfate's almost like your bioaccumulation through a system. You have mercury through it, it's going to work itself up the food chain. Well, sulfate's like that. It's not really going to precipitate, so you can kind of track it through a system. So I always think it's real important to look at, just to make sure that you're capturing everything, or there's another discharge out there that you haven't sampled. But as you can see, especially those big four, a vast majority of the iron loading, vast majority of acidity loading, particularly Cameron, it's 58% out of those discharges, it's 58% of the acid loading. And then when you take a look at that sulfate loading, those four are 88% of the sulfate loading. So, it's all about those big four. And then the question, and here's another question, how do you get some of these other discharges? If you're going to build a plant for Scott and Excelsior, Corbin and Maysville isn't that far away. Maysville has a tremendous negative net hot acidity that could essentially help in treatment, because these discharges, while large, they're positive net acidity, but they're not positive very much. So I'll do some mixing here and kind of show you some thoughts there. But so we're starting here, we're kind of melding into to a singular idea. So again, to me, the most important water quality statistic when you're looking at a watershed in total and trying to figure out if you're capturing everything is that sulfate. You follow the sulfate. And what this shows, so there was a sampling point, an EP camera was sampling right at essentially Big Mountain, where Shamokin Creek got out of the mining geology, broke through, and the sulfate loading error is about, that's in pounds per day, so 77,451. The total of those 8 is 74,000. So those 8 discharges are like 94% of the sulfate loading in Shamokin Creek. So what's the other 6%? Oh, there's smaller flows, there's AML sites, there's this and that. But it kind of is it gives you a sense that you've captured, those are the players. So now how do you go about treating those players and getting them together to where you're not building 8 or 9 treatment plants, you're building 2 or 3 maybe. And the big four too, even looking at I think it's the big 4, 8, yeah. I thought I had there it is, 68%. Those discharges are 68% of the flow of Shamokin Creek as it's going out Big Mountain. So really good indication that those are the discharges of record that you have to do something with. So where do you start? It's gonna be tough here to see a little bit as I had to expand a little bit, but I made the volcano. I was like, ooh, I'm gonna use those for the big discharges. So there's Scott, there's Excelsior, Cameron, and Sterling down there. And then the smaller ones are in white, they're tough to see, but Richards is way up here in the headwaters. And then you got Corbin and Maysville are very close together right here. And then Big Mountain is close to Sterling. So you could start seeing what I'm thinking here. Excelsior's kind of, like I said, it's like its own project, kind of trying to figure out how to get this water back into Scott, so then you could take 2 discharges to 1. To me, that's a project that should be considered. So that's can you treat? And the other one then is can you treat Scott and Excelsior at one plant with Corbin and Maysville included? So you can see it's not a big circle. When you draw the circle, the area is not very large. Can you get something in here to where you can get these discharges to it? And when I say get these discharges to it, I'm not saying that we would capture from the outfall and then convey them, through piping. Is there even possibilities of impact, or grabbing from the mine pools and getting that circle closer to where the plant site is? That's a possibility there. And then, can you treat Big Mountain? Can you put Big Mountain in the Sterling pool? I'll get to that here in a little bit. I think there's the ability to either capture Big Mountain at where it pops, where it outfalls, and get it in Sterling, or there's some mine mapping that indicates that they were once connected, and could that be the way to use? So it's all about making 2 discharges one, putting 4 discharges together in one plant, and then it starts making sense as to not, having 8 treatment plants that have operation and maintenance costs. And then, like I said, what the hell's going on in Richards? That's, to me, that's almost like a separate project. So this is the way I've always thought, and I've been looking at Shamokin Creek ever since I was at SRBC. It was like that thing I always kind of looked at and wanted my hands on it. And this is kind of like the way I've kind of thought about going after this. So plant 1 would be like Sterling and Big Mountain. The idea would be to capture and inject in some way Big Mountain to the Sterling pool, making them 1 discharge. And what's interesting about that is Big Mountain is net acidic, not terribly so, but it's net acidic. Sterling has this massive net alkalinity to it, right? So essentially, can Sterling eat up, for lack of better, Big Mountain? Construct an aeration lime clarifier plant near Sterling outfall. The reason I have that question mark there is that is a quality, it's very Banning-esque, where you might essentially not need lime to treat that water. You can use decarbonation, you can do sludge recirculation once you seed it with maybe lime, and that becomes your lime source. And when you can take lime out of the equation, that brings your costs way down. So this site has potential for that. So key tasks, questions, capture Big Mountain outfall, convey and inject Big Mountain to Sterling. The one thing that, here's the question, like these questions that we don't have answers to that keep us from going the how and where. We don't have a very good mine pool record there. We had someone going out there every so often and doing like a manual reading of the mine pool elevation. It'd be great to get a transducer down there to where we're doing it hourly for a whole year and then tie that to the flows of the discharge and then to precipitation. Those are the things that need to be done and haven't been done yet. Select plant site and acquire property. Sludge storage is also, that might dictate where you're considering building that plant, where the best spot is can you inject it back in the mine per se, possibly. And then construct plant, and what's nice about this is that this plant would restore Carbon Run, which is a major tributary to Shamokin Creek. There's been a lot of work upstream, a lot of it done by my colleague Brad Schultz back there, that has brought back the upper end of Carbon Run. Looks pretty good where Sterling dumps in. You get Sterling, Carbon Run comes back. So that's kind of like plant 1. And so I forgot this map. Right here, this is the barrier pillar, and I forgot who sent me this. I don't know if it was Woody or Heather, or if you guys sent me this. I can't remember, but when whoever sent me this, I was like, oh, look at that. There's the barrier pillar between Big Mountain and Sterling. And if you look right here, it says solid brick dam, January 1934. And there's the rock tunnel between. So the question is, which way is this flowing? Is this, if we broke this, does this flow to here, to Sterling Run? And then this goes away. So there's all these questions we don't have answers to yet. But we got to get to those answers to decide, where and how we're building these plants. Why Sterling plant should be first? In my mind, it may be the easiest of the bunch to treat. Shamokin area, I love it. I grew up in Wimber, Pennsylvania, and Shamokin kind of just reminds me of it. I feel like home when I'm there. But it's an EJA area, environmental justice area. It just needs a win. Those people deserve clean water. Carbon Run is the easiest point to get them that first step into clean water. Would restore 1.2 miles of carbon. It's one of the big 4, so you would take a decent bite of that apple, 17% of the iron, 9% of the acid. And it could be like a strict decarbonization sludge circulation plant. I did some real quick and dirty stuff in AMD treat. And it looks like we can, modeling suggests we can push, just using Maelstrom oxidizers, the pH up to 7.1. So it doesn't take much from 7.1 lime-wise to get to like, where you're looking at 7.5, 7.7 there. But in terms of like, as soon as you get sludge, a decent amount of sludge, you can recirculate that sludge and that becomes your lime source. And then you can get rid of lime and then you start saving money. And DEP's always, they're interested in this because the more money they can save here, the more money they can put somewhere else. Most significant question though is how you manage high flows here. 600 does not scare me. 2,700 does not scare me. That scares the shit out of me. 17,000 gallons per minute. When you put Big Mountain in, it's another 5 on top of that. That's a lot of water. It gets high quick, it gets low quick, but how do you manage that? So the question is like, can the mine pool be managed and pumped to accommodate those short high flow periods to essentially cut off peak flows to where you're, instead of like this, like I said, you're more of a sine curve there. Then it becomes like super easy to treat that water. But like one of the problems we have here is like this was a borehole in Sterling, and at some point here it just stopped being monitored. And if you look down here, this is off of EPCAM or one of your reports. Water at surface sleeve damage not valid. So like we got to get out there and see if this is accessible. If it's not accessible, can we improve it? Do we have to drill another one? Those are the things that we have to figure out. So plant 2, this will be the one that kind of pushes Shamokin over the precipice. It's Scott and Excelsior. They're the 2 biggest iron producers in the watershed. They're the 2 biggest flows in the watershed. But you're also very close to Corbin and Excelsior. So this is kind of like, isn't this like an industrial park? Yeah, and I started taking a look at this. I was like, well, it's kind of equidistant between Scott, Excelsior, and the 2 smaller ones. Could we get the water somewhere within that industrial park, and that's where you build the plant, right? So those are the questions, though. That it's about, the Scott is the furthest away from that point in the middle, and it's only 1.1 miles. We're moving water up Morris Run like 3 miles to get it to a centralized plant, so 1.1 is nothing. It's a large flow. Captured from outfall or pumped from pool. Can we pump it from pool instead of the outfall? It's a question to be answered. There's decarbonization potential here, intense. Can that decarbonization and the Maysville high alkalinity overcome the acidity? It's a question that deserves an answer. Can pools be maintained to cut off peaks? That is the main problem in Shamokin Creek. Can these pools somehow be managed to where we're not, and you'll see the flows of these things here in a second. I mean, these are just the median flows of Scott and Excelsior. So when you add and this is a mix. So I was like, all right, if you take all these flows, mix them up, what is essentially going to be your influent product, right? So that's your influent product down here. But you're talking just median, you're talking 12,000 gallons a minute. That's doable, right? We have plants that are on the verge of that size, right? With worse water quality. And like this water quality is like, when you mix these 2 together, you start getting to the point where you might be net alkaline there in terms of hot acidity. Iron's 21, aluminum is inconsequential. So then it becomes, you just got to get that out. You just got to get that 21 out. These 4 outfalls mix creates a mildly net acidic or net alkaline product, it looks like. Can decarbonization push that net alkalinity further? Or it should be like more pH and getting that metal acidity out is what that should say. How much, if any, lime would you need to treat? Could this be another sludge recirculation plant where you kind of use that sludge as your lime source? You're going to have to figure out how to inject over a ton and a half of lime or of sludge per day. That's just mainly iron there. Yeah, that is iron. So that's 3,000 there. You're going to have a little bit of aluminum. You're going to have calcite there. So there's going to be a lot of sludge you got to figure out what to do with. But like I say, I'll keep going back to how do you cut off the max flows and make it more manageable. Scott and Excelsior, we have a little better record, but it's still like look at the dates here. It's like 1 record per year. We just need more data there over a hydrologic year. But these things naturally flow 20 feet 30 feet in range, So the question then becomes, and this is for a hydrogeologist, I'm a biologist, but the question becomes, can you control this through pumping to where you can cut off these, these peak flows here that are coming from the elevations getting really high in the pool? You can't answer that question until we get adequate data collectors within the mine pools at the discharge points, all that jazz. But like, if you can store water and then release, store, and dry, I mean, that's of interest for people like SRBC, right, Pierre? So like, if we prove this, we can do it, like briefcase full of money towards, like you're on the record right now, by the way, we're recording all this, right? Okay, we're going to hear about it tomorrow, so he'll answer that question. But SRBC is looking for ways to mitigate low flow periods. This might be a way to do it, right? So they may be interested in being part of the solution. I work there, so I can say that. So necessary, kind of a summation of what we need to do. Inventory of pool boreholes, what open, what isn't, what needs drilled for transducer installation. That's kind of like step one. Transducer installs on all major outfalls and boreholes for hydrologic year quantity determination. That has not been done yet and needs done. All that transducer data compiled and compiling elevations and flows tied to a local rain gauge. In Shade Creek, we just bought our own rain gauge and we slapped it in the middle of the 4 discharges because I don't want to like tie something to an airport rain gauge 20 miles away. I want it right there. So that would be something I would suggest here as well. Here's the next thing, we're talking about that 6 to 10% that it isn't captured by these discharges. Well, where is it? To me, investigation analysis of stream loss sections to the underlying mine pools needs done, and I'll touch on it here shortly. Transducers installed upstream and downstream of lows so we can create ratings curves to figure out the quantity of volume lost. And then Shamokin Creek is just, peppered with abandoned mine lands. And you know what happens? They're a funnel. So each of these pits has a watershed, and that watershed puts water into the pit. Where do you think that water's going? Right down into the mine pool. Reclamation will help us reduce those high flow periods coming out of these outfalls. So those are the 2 other things that need to be considered here, not just the discharges. So my favorite map again, sorry, Bobby and Mike, but yours are cool too, so don't feel bad. But like, I always love this one just for its like simplicity, So, it's just one of these things where here's of interest. So we talked about all these. This is Locust Creek tributary to Shamokin Creek. This thing is highly dry. It's dry for a lot of the year, right? This is peppered with AML up here. And what's crazy about it is this mine pool here is drained to the Mahanoy. It doesn't go to the Shamokin. So anything we do up here to keep the stream on top, to reclaim the AMLs, keeps the good water to Shamokin Creek, improving our situation there, and improves Mahanoy Creek because they'll get less bad water. So like that area has always been of supreme interest to me because I think you can make abatement gains, there instead of treatment gains. So it's just another kind of example of that. This is one on Locust Summit there. This is abandoned mine land 360204. It's a P1, so someone got hurt or, unfortunately killed there. I'm not sure, but like that's why it's a P1, I do believe. It overlies the Locust Gap Tunnel, which drains to Mahanoy Creek. I bet you all of this area here drains to this pool. And it's just a big funnel. It's going right down into the mine pool that's now coming out in Mahanoy. So we can help the Mahanoy group out by reclaiming this, giving us more water in Shamokin Creek. Last slide, I think. Additional questions. What about Cameron? To me, you build the first 2 plants and then you reevaluate because iron is the biggest player, and getting Sterling, Scott, and Excelsior takes the biggest apple of the iron. So I would do those 2 plants and then reevaluate. What about Richards? That shaft discharge wasn't always there. What caused it? I think it's a separate project to try to get that down into the Scott pool. What about the smaller outfalls? Colbert's real close to Scott. I think that's easy to grab. Mid-Valley and Buck, I don't think they move the needle much. So it's going to be one of those things you treat everything else. You might not have to treat those. I think you'll get more gains with AML reclamation and reduction of stream loss stretches than looking at those smaller flows. That's all I got. Questions, or are we going to do it at the panel? Okay, perfect. Thank you.